What you're about to watch is an extremely fascinating lecture about the history of the development of War Plan Orange over the decades, as well as the involvement of wargaming and the US Naval War College. It's going to be hosted by Pete Pellegrino, who is a wargame designer at the college, and he's an absolutely fascinating host. I definitely recommend you check out the entirety of the video, but to help you out, definitely refer to these timestamps to allow you to jump between different portions of the presentation. And with that being said, I'm going to pass you on to Pete. You're in good hands, and I'll see you on the other side.
The interwar period between 1919 and up to about 1939, 1938 or so here at the War College is often characterized by this period of intense wargaming for the purposes of developing the plan to defeat Japan. The truth is a little bit less romantic, less dramatic, no less important, but that's not exactly how it played out. And so we found some old footage of a victory at sea, and if you remember the docudramas that were made shortly after the war, that talks about this time period where the War College is doing the planning. So let's take a look at that footage first. So, as you see at the end of that video clip, not quite what happened here at the college. The college's role with War Plan Orange and the War of Japan is often characterized in mythic terms. And in some ways, it's convenient to talk about it in the terms of a myth. The American myth around Thanksgiving is often characterized by imagery of pilgrims in black and white outfits and belt buckle hats, and cheerful Indians, and we're all sharing a turkey dinner. The actual history of the time period is far more brutal. King Philip's War occurs during this time period. Disease, famine, warfare decimate both the Native American populations and the colonists' populations. But there is still value in understanding the history as well as though the myth, because in parts the myths embody what we want to think are the better nature in American culture. Likewise, War Plan Orange and the interwar wargaming leading up to World War II has some of this same mythic quality to it. And while the myth is important to understand how it shapes how the United States Naval War College and the United States Navy thinks of itself and the values it holds, it's handy to understand the history as well. So let's talk about the history a bit. War Plan Orange and people's general awareness of it is usually tied to the famous Nimitz quote. Admiral Nimitz, when he was here after the war, retired in 1960, was talking to the student body. And as part of his talk, he makes the statement that the war with Japan had been enacted in the game rooms at the War College by so many people in so many different ways that nothing that happened during the war was a surprise. Absolutely nothing, except kamikaze tactics towards the end of the war. We had not visualized these. Nimitz makes that statement in October of 1960, as I said, in talking to the students. And at the college, we're fortunate to actually have the recording. And when you put that quote in the larger context of what he's talking about at the time, he's talking about the value of military education. And while people have seized upon the nothing was unexpected portions, the words they should have focused on were by so many people, so many different ways. Nimitz is trying to communicate the idea that it wasn't just the game he played, and Nimitz is a student in 1923. So it's not like the Navy he's got on the floor of the wargaming facilities here at the War College is the Navy he's going to fight with 20 years later. Okay? It's dreadnoughts and biplanes, and clearly not the Navy he fought with. And yet, he still finds value. Another thing to remember is not only is it not the Navy in terms of 20 years on, during the wargaming of that time period, we got several things wrong. in terms of wargaming. And this is where people want wargaming to be this highly accurate representation of reality. And yet we know, in hindsight, that our gaming of Japanese night naval tactics was inaccurate. Our gaming with some of the technologies, like the long lance torpedo the Japanese used, we woefully underestimated its range and capability. So that was wrong. How we employed submarines during the war games did not work out to be the way we used them in actual course of the war. Amphibious landings, while discussed as part of some of these games, were never actually gamed out. And the technologies at the time that Nimitz was a student would not have existed and to do the sorts of amphibious landings that we eventually do in the Pacific. Naval aviation, we mirror imaged the Japanese. We assumed that they would use carriers in a manner similar to our own. All of these are mistakes that some would say should have detracted from the value of the wargaming. But because Nimitz doesn't see this as some sort of oracle, as some sort of predictive tool, he sees it as an activity which, because he and many others had the opportunity to have this shared experience, to wrestle with the problem, and to develop the mindset and the mental tools, as we call them, habits of mind, that allows him to then apply those skill sets that he honed on the wargaming floor in the actual conflict. So that's really the context of the Nimitz quote. So it's not that wargaming had this predictive power. It's that the wargaming covered so many different possibilities. And the games covered things that didn't happen in the war, things that happened in the war that didn't happen in the games. So it's not about the game and the outcome per se. It's how you play, not necessarily how it happened. So within that context, we have War Plan Orange. And the first thing we have to kind of get our heads around is what exactly was War Plan Orange? And War Plan Orange was one of the many plans that the United States Navy, along with other parts of the service, were working on to address specific threats. And the colors were a standard convention at the time. Orange always referred to the Japanese. War Plan Black was for the war against Germany. War Plan Red was Britain. So all the adversaries had a color code associated with them. So War Plan Orange is really broken down into three chunks. And we kind of think of it as this depiction of a strand of DNA. And within this strand of DNA, we have three major bits. Phase one was, what are we going to do to secure the Western United States in terms of a threat from Japan? So we have to secure the Eastern Pacific, basically from Hawaii to California. Phase three is, once we've crossed over and we've defeated the Japanese Navy, how will we compel the nation of Japan to surrender? What exactly does that look like? Phase two is in the middle, which is, having secured the Western United States, how do we then get to Japan to have this grand naval battle, which will eliminate the Imperial Japanese Navy and allow us to blockade and compel Japan to surrender? Phase one we work out fairly quickly. By 1912, we really have quickly understood that just as it's going to be difficult for us to get to Japan, it's equally difficult for Japan to get to us. Some may criticize that was a oversimplification in terms of the threat, because obviously Hawaii is attacked. But there's never a plausible large-scale threat to the Western United States. And plans to address it are fairly quickly settled, and that part of the plan is fairly understood by 1912. Likewise, the end phase is pretty understood too, in terms of, by about 1929, as air power is becoming more and more of a substantial warfighting capability, we see that most likely the concluding part of this war is going to be conducted with a naval blockade supported by air bombardment, because now aircraft can actually carry a payload that could do sizable damage that in theory could compel Japan to surrender. So it's the bits in the middle is the sloppy part that we wrestle with for decades. This is phase two part. And in this presentation, you can see I use a color coding to kind of indicate the different schools of thought. War Plan Orange is usually characterized as simply two competing schools of thought. Let's race across the Pacific as fast as we can and have a major battle with the Japanese Navy somewhere in the home waters, the home islands of Japan. or take a more measured step-by-step island hopping campaign, as it's later referred, to get to Japan. So the rush across folks tend to be referred to as thrusters because they're going to rapidly thrust across the Pacific. And the folks that are going slower are called the cautionaries. And in some ways, it's a bit of a pejorative term because at the time, the criticism of the cautionaries was the plan was just too cautious. It was too slow. The American public would never put up with a war that took that long. We just need to quickly dash across, win the fight. So the dark orange color in this presentation gives you an idea of when the thrusters were kind of the predominant thinking. The tan color shows you when cautionaries were more to the fore. And there is a third camp. They were what we were called the Western Arsenal folks, who looked at the whole problem of global power projection and said, well, England is a world power. And part of the reason they're a world power is because they have colonies and bases around the world that allow them to extend and exert naval power from those distant ports. Why don't we do that? Why doesn't the United States? We're an emerging naval power. We've won the war of the Spanish-American War, which really kind of starts setting the American century. And in that war, we've acquired the Philippines. Why don't we set up distant bases on the Philippines, just like the British have distant bases in Gibraltar, Hong Kong, Singapore? So those are called the Western Arsenal folks. And they do influence the plan for a period of time. But we'll find that it's not so much gaming, but other world events that eliminate them from really further consideration. So we've got these really two camps. We'll talk a little bit about the Western Arsenal folks, but really what we have are these two camps, the thrusters and the cautionaries. And the thrusters, some people have tried to characterize as being foolhardy and not really understanding the dimensions of the Pacific and that this would never work logistically, and the cautionaries are a far smarter bunch. But when you look at who exactly the thrusters were, they're not exactly lightweights in naval strategy. Dewey, George Dewey, hero of the Spanish-American War, is a thruster. And he is the first chair of the Joint Army-Navy Board, and he's part of that cadre of senior thinkers who sets the tone and that we can surely cross the Pacific quickly, because the American public would demand no less. Alfred Thayer Mahan is a thruster. His whole work around the influence of sea power on history, you can certainly see where he would be of that thrusting nature to say that it's about naval power pushed forward, not naval power held back at your coast. That matters and shapes a great nation. Ernest King, he is a class of 1933 at the War College, will go on to be the Chief of Naval Operations during the war, has a thrusting streak in him. And Bull Halsey, again, if you think of Halsey's personality, you can't imagine him being anything but a thruster and his versus aggressive approach to naval warfare. But again, these aren't small men when it comes to naval strategy. On the cautionary side, you can see we have folks like Nimitz, class of 23, and his colleagues. We have Spruance, Sherman, Turner. All of these folks will be pivotal players in the war in the Pacific. All of them are War College graduates, but they fall into a slightly different camp. So which group of men were having their sway at what time is influenced by a variety of things. And this is where we can't just lift this time period out of its geopolitical context and just look at the wargaming part of it by itself. So what we have here is a rather busy graphic, but what it tries to show is between a general time period of, from about 1907 or so, with the World War I looming, through the very early period of World War II, we look at what's going on geopolitically, what's happening in technologies, institutions and how they're changing, and then people and their personalities. Who's in what leadership role? Because this is going to shape how we look at the interwar period. And then the lower third of the image here kind of shows the ebb and flow of who's popular and who's out. Who are the cool kids and who are the kids that are disfavored in terms of their ideas around which of these ideas, thrusting, cautionary, or arsenal folks, are in the fore. So on the little graphic here, as you can see, the higher you are on the scale, the more popular your thinking is, the more mainstream you're considered, and the lower you are on the scale, the less favored your ideas are. And so you can see in the early years, the arsenal and thrusting group is at the fore of thinking. And anyone of a cautionary approach tends to be very low and not thought much of. And matter of fact, here's the first time where the War College kind of runs at cross purposes with the General Board. The whole reason we're war planning against Japan in the first place is driven by a series of geopolitical events. We have the Russia-Japanese War, which clearly demonstrates that Japan is a power to be reckoned with. They're not some minor Asian player that we can ignore. And there's an immigration scare that occurs with Japanese and Chinese immigrants coming to the United States. In part, it's for labor. We're building, the industrial revolution is obviously full steam, and we are carving up the country, creating railroads, building, and this takes labor. And so there is an influx of laborers to the country. Most of these situations with the labor part, the immigration scare, is resolved diplomatically, but it set military leaders kind of on edge to think that here we have someone who we've already had a diplomatic brush with, and they've demonstrated naval capability, so we should maybe think about some plans for that. And initially, the War College is in line with this thinking in terms of thrusting across the Pacific. I remember we've had the Great White Fleet sail around the world. Clearly, we were a naval power. And able to project power at great distances. So between the high enthusiasm from going around the world with the Great White Fleet, as well as the general thinking of Alfred Thayer Mahan, of Dewey, we're pretty much so pushing a through-ticket plan. But the War College comes up with the idea that the more they look at it, they begin to question some of the timing and tempo issues. And the War College goes before the General Board and presents an idea that a more cautionary approach may be appropriate, where we take a series of islands across the Pacific and use those as stepping stones to get to Japan. This is roundly rejected by the General Board, who sees this as just what they call it, too cautionary. It's going to take too long. Remember that the Spanish-American War is over in a blink type of thing. So it's 1898, and we're pretty much so wrapped everything up. So there's no reason to expect why Japan wouldn't be as easy a foe to topple. So this cautionary thing is too slow. And you talk about taking islands. The law of armed conflict limits what property you can invade, whose country you can take, or a territory you can use in the course of the conflict. And Japan has no islands in the middle that we're going to be able to take as these stepping stones. They belong to others who are likely to be non-belligerents and therefore aren't going to give us islands to use. So the whole thing has problems, and the War College gets a bit defensive. Realize at this point, war planning at the college is a collateral duty for the faculty. There's a small number of faculty, 6 to 8 faculty members, who do this war planning on behalf of the General Board as a secondary duty. Their first and foremost duty is to teach. So the college comes back and says, well, hang on. If you want us to relook at this problem, I really need more resources to do it properly. And so we're either going to need, more faculty, basically, and more funding to be able to properly do this war planning. And this becomes a contest of he said, she said, in terms of either did we quit or were we fired? In some writings you'll read, the War College quit and decided that they're going to focus purely on the academic mission and stop contributing to this war planning. And other authors have suggested that the General Board fired the Navy. But either way, the Navy didn't get the money. They didn't get the expanded faculty. And we pretty much withdraw from directly contributing to war planning. And this kind of characterizes this period up into World War I. Now, the college shuts down in World War I. But as we come out of World War I, and William Sims, who was the head of the American Expeditionary Force to the naval part to England, comes back and he becomes president of the Naval War College. And so this kind of restarts things. Now, whether or not we're going to be able to continue to try to think along these thrusting lines and the cautionary line, or this slower stepping stone approach, in part now begins to be shaped by some technology. During World War I, submarines and aircraft, which enter the war as a rudimentary warfighting capability at best, submarines go down more often than they can come up. Planes really can't do much more than provide an intelligence, the scouting role. They don't carry a significant payload. Their air capabilities are relatively limited. By the end of the war, aviation has made dramatic improvements, as has undersea warfare. So this new threat from under the water and from above the water begins to become a serious consideration in the survivability of a Navy fleet in its attempt to sail from point A to point B. So during this time period, as we're looking at the increased threat that aircraft and submarines pose, we're going through some reorganization within the Navy. Actually, we have the first Chief of Naval Operations as a office is formed, along with his supporting office. And the first CNO, Admiral Benson, is more of a cautionary and is more supportive of that approach. And so while we're looking at the post-World War I era, and a big boost that comes out of World War I is property changes hands. Islands, which were previously German property, in the war spoils divvying up, go to Japan. So here we've solved part of the problem. What islands will we hop to? These new Japanese islands. So this really boosts, and as you can see, after the war, the yellow line representing our cautionary folks ramps up quite a bit. And this is part propelled by this thought that we now have islands to hop to. But there's another fallout from World War II, which will further reinforce or at least pull down one of the other thoughts, and that's the Western Arsenal, folks. So as we go into the Washington Treaty, and we start doing the Washington Naval Treaty, and we're going to do this agreed upon ratio that sets the relative firepower and tonnage between the United States, Great Britain, and Japan. Part of the bargaining chips that the United States throws on the table to get a higher ratio for themselves is that they will no longer develop any bases west of the international date line. So this is a bargaining chip for Japan, because Japan's going to come out on the short end of all of this in terms of the smallest ratio of fire or naval power. And so we say that we will not go and create a huge naval base in the Philippines. So right away, that takes the entire argument around Western Arsenal, folks, and that drives, as you can see on our diagram here, drives them to the bottom. So we've basically eliminated them because we've eliminated our willingness to develop these bases in the Western Pacific. And for a brief, shiny moment, the cautionaries kind of surge to the front of the group. But again, personalities matter. And part of what happens now is coming back from World War I, Blackjack Pershing, the general commander of the U.S. Expeditionary Forces, assumes leadership of the board. And Pershing is, of his nature, a thruster. And just as quickly as the cautionaries rose to preeminence, they were suppressed again. And so we enter into this period as we're coming into the late 20s and early 30s, where the through ticket, or the thrusting people, while still preeminent, they're beginning to realize that there's problems with that plan. And a lot of it has to do with, where are we going to go? We say we're going to thrust across the Pacific. Okay, to where? And if we think we're going to zip over to someplace in the Philippines, increasingly more and more of the Philippines is coming under the reach of Japanese air power. So we keep wandering further south through the Philippine Islands, trying to figure out where this fleet that has just steamed across the Pacific is going to stop, because it's going to have to refuel, rearm, prepare itself for battle. Where's that going to be? And increasingly, this keeps moving from the northern Philippines and Luzon to Mindanao to further south and further south and further south, and then we start thinking about Guam. So even the through ticket people are realizing that there's increasingly a standoff problem that's being imposed by air. Then, as we continue to move into the early 30s, as the War College is doing its wargaming, which is still primarily for student education. We're not wargaming. When we talk about war games at the college and they have a war game orange, it's not because we're working on war plan orange. It's because we're just simply working on a war game The adversary happens to be Japan, and the color code for Japan is orange. So the game is about doing a fight with Japan, not about Warplan Orange development. Likewise, we're also fighting the British. Not that we had serious thoughts that we're going to go to war with England, but because they were considered to be the team to beat. The Royal Navy was the preeminent naval power. So what better navy to put yourself up against to test yourself? So we're gaming primarily for the benefit of the students, not because we're contributing directly to a war plan. Now, that's not to say that after our falling out prior to World War I with the Navy leadership, that we're going to have nothing to do with war planning. The president of the Naval War College sits on the general board. He's one of the board members, along with the chief of naval operations and the chair of the board. So there is a personal relationship there. And over the decades, there is a bit of mending of fences. And the War College does become more involved with supporting the planning activity in terms of taking on a particular vignette that would be that the Navy leadership is interested in, and could that be folded into a game, again, primarily for the students, but perhaps the Navy leadership can learn something from that as well. Likewise, we have situations where, because of the Naval Treaty, we're experimenting with ship designs. And it's not a time period where we can just build a ship to see if it works. We're trying to use gaming to some extent to understand the utility of certain types of ships. And so that fell to the faculty, when proposed with a new ship type, to look at existing ships, look at existing rules from our war games, to say, well, if in our war game we have a destroyer and with these characteristics, and a battleship has these characteristics, this new thing that's being proposed is kind of part destroyer, part battleship. So we'll use the speed numbers from this, the armor numbers from that, and we'll take half of the firepower and we'll make it be that. I mean, it is kind of just guesswork, cobbling together something. But then given those attributes, and then giving the student the opportunity to use a ship with these characteristics, the question is, do the students find it of utility? So we're doing some of that in this period of the now into the 30s, when they're doing the gaming that increasingly, though, is showing a problem. Game after game is showing increased attrition to this battle fleet. This battle fleet we're going to form up in California, form up in Pearl Harbor, and steam across the Pacific, that has to make it in good shape to fight the Imperial Japanese Navy, is suffering more and more attrition on the way across. And this attrition is coming from Japanese air bases, which are in those islands, Japanese submarines, which are operating from those forward bases, in addition to running into some of the outer defense line ships for the Imperial Japanese Navy. And no matter what the students try to do, they're still stuck with this attrition problem. So if they just try to go pushing past, they start with maybe a dozen battleships, and by the time they find themselves in the Philippines, they're down to 10, so they've lost 2. The next class, it's down to 8. Next class is down to 6. These are unacceptable losses. So this is what really begins, you can see that slow upswing again with our cautionary folks, to really understand what gaming is trying to tell us. And again, the gaming, I always say, is focused more on the students, but it doesn't mean we're not pulling some lessons from it writ large. And we actually have the head of our strategy and policy part of the college, Captain Van Auken, who goes back and looks at several years worth of gaming, trying to figure out, is there something to learn here? Is there a message that seems to be telegraphed through multiple games? And that message seems to be, you can't ignore these interior islands that are going to pose some sort of threat. And so by the time we come up on the verge of war, and remember, for the officers attending the college, this isn't a hypothetical problem. Right? This isn't a if we go to war. This is when we go to war. So that's why the college's gaming is very much so centered on getting officers ready to fight in the near term. These aren't futures games where we wonder, well, what if we gave you a Navy of 20 years from now, and how does that work? These are officers who most likely in their lifetime are going to be at war. It's the trend through the centuries up to this point. So as we see Japan invade Manchuria, the storm clouds are gathering, diplomatic relationships are obviously souring between the United States and Japan, we are kind of on the cusp of war. And this is where we realize that all of this wargaming, which has been the United States versus a single adversary, it's a one-on-one fight. Blue versus red, blue versus orange, blue versus whichever color we're fighting, black. It's not going to be that. We're looking at a world conflict now with most likely 2 fronts. and we're going to have to think about how do we deal with both an Atlantic battle and a Pacific battle, and we're going to have allies. So we hope to have allies and more than one adversary. So now we take all these color plans, the red plan, the orange plan, the blue, and we're going to merge them together, what's called the rainbow plans. And this is where the rainbow plans come from. It's a combination of all these other colors, and it's just clever at the time. They say, well, it's a rainbow. But inherent in those rainbow plans are the bits and pieces of the old Navy-centric plans. And that's because it's what the Navy knows and understands for these plans. So as we kind of come up to the point now where we're on the kind of the cusp of war, Admiral Stark has to address what is going to be the naval strategy. And he writes something that's called the Dog Memorandum. And as you can see here, really he simply has a 2x2 choice. I've got the Atlantic, I've got the Pacific. I can go on the offense or I can go on the defense. So that sets him up in a 2x2 box. And what does he do? And Plan Able says just basically go on the defense of both coasts. Baker, for Plan B, has them going on the offense first on the West Coast, but stay defensive in the Atlantic. Plan Charlie is go with the offense at the same time on both coasts, which would have been logistically a challenge for the United States. And then finally, Plan D, was to go at least initially defensive in the Western Pacific and go on the offense in the Atlantic. And this becomes the European First, Rainbow 5 plan. But that said, I think Admiral Stark and the Navy in general always kind of had in their pocket War Plan Orange, or at least gaming for Orange, that yes, there was war planning done at different parts of the Navy, but for the vast number of officers, their exposure and understanding of the war or a war in the Pacific is from war gaming when they're students passing through the War College. So this idea that it's the war plan that comes out of the colleges is no. It's a bunch of officers who are very savvy about how to fight in this type of environment. So as we kind of look at the myths that were surrounding this whole the thing that we've talked about here, the idea that the War College drafted the strategy during the Interwar years is not true, because after 1911, the college was excluded from planning. Now, we do know that there was, again, some rapprochement where we redeveloped that relationship with the Navy planners. But again, the college remains primarily focused on the educational mission for the students. Myth number 2, this idea that the War College gamed and kept revising War Plan Orange, is again a bit of a fallacy, because we didn't own the plan. We were simply gaming and regaming the problem with Japan as the situation kept changing. Technologies were changing, fleet compositions were changing, weapons were changing. So that's why we kept regaming. It's part of the curriculum. Not so much as that we're working directly on trying to fix this plan. This island hopping part, the third myth, that somehow that was that came out of the interwar period gaming, we can see from our timeline that was actually suggested back in 1911, but it had problems. At the time, it wasn't politically acceptable, and I had some issues with the actual islands we were going to hop to. But it's an early idea. It's not one that just pops out of the wargaming period in the 1920s and 30s. And finally, this idea that the whole reason the through ticket portion, they were going to race across as a thruster across the Pacific, failed, wasn't because of the logistics. Some people said, well, clearly there's no way we're going to get the Great White Fleet went around the world, but it was really in rough shape when it came back. And logistically, trying to get ships across the Pacific is impractical. Well, it's not impractical in terms of we can certainly cross the Pacific, but it's how quickly we could. And some of the problems with crossing the Pacific were solved when we went from a coal-fired Navy to an oil-fired Navy. And we begin to perfect the ability to replenish at sea. Coaling was a terrible, dirty, slow operation. But transferring fuel oil between vessels was a much easier prospect. And oil had a much better energy ratio that allowed a ship to go further than it did under coal. So it's not a logistics problem. It's an attrition and threat problem that kind of drives us finally to thinking about how we approach this from a cautionary tale. So all this gaming, here you can see that here's all the games that were played at the War College between the years from 1919 up to 1941. And if in our diagram here, if it's in orange, it's a game against Japan. If it's in red, it's a game against Britain. And if it's in black, it's a game against Germany. If it's solid colored, it's a tactical game, and if it's in hash marks, we're looking at a strategic game. So you can see that the gaming covered more than just Japan, and again, people are often surprised to find out how much we gamed against the Royal Navy. And again, not because they were a potential adversary, but because they were the kids to beat. They were the best folks out there. So you look at this whole timeline, and that's 318 games that are played in this time period. So of that, if we kind of look at one particular year, and we look at 1932, in the class of 1932, there's about 320 some curriculum days. Of those, almost every one of them, 303, are spent gaming. Gaming is the curricular activity. So it is by gaming that the students learn. So if we take and look at this, the type of topics that we are dealing with, it's both strategy and tactics. And the strategies, as you can see, deal with crossing the Pacific from a northern route. How might we defend Hawaii and the Panama Canal? What are the approaches to dealing with issues in the Atlantic and the Caribbean? So we've got the kind of those large strategic issues about fleet placement and theaters, but then we're also into the tactics: night fighting, logistics, landing operations, the fleet battle line, mining, aircraft, etc. You can see all the different topics that were covered by the various games. So let's go and now pick apart just one of the gears. So we take here, and we've taken the class of 1932, and we've expanded them out a bit to see how do they spend their time gaming. And as you can see in the very beginning of our timeline here, it's tactical presentations. Remember that the class is going to be a combination of aviators, submarine officers, surface warfare officers who may not be thoroughly familiar with their other colleagues' warfare area. So in the beginning, we have just some basic tactical presentations that help all the students understand the capabilities they'll be playing with in the war games. And that runs about a week or so. Then we go through a time period, just a short time period, but again, it's 3 dedicated days where the students review scouting procedures. Scouting procedures. It's clearly it becomes important to understand who finds who first in a naval battle, particularly as we move into the age of aircraft, where the person who gains contact first has a huge tactical advantage. So understanding how to do scouting, how to arrange those patterns, how to use ships and aircraft to effectively search the ocean is a crucial part of being able to play the games. And so we have 3 days dedicated just to understanding the mechanics for how to scout. Then we move into what are basically the demonstration period, where you have to learn how to play the game. And the best way to play is just to do some practice games. You're not being graded, so to speak. And again, this is just a demonstration period in the curriculum for the wargaming portion, where we're learning how to play the tactical game. Likewise, then we go into a period that runs about 17 days or so, where we're learning how to play the strategic games. And again, these differ significantly in terms of the tactical games are often played with small ships on the gaming floor, whereas the strategic games are typically played at the map level, where you're just charting fleets moving across vast chunks of ocean. Having done all that now, so basically, we've spent the first month of the curriculum learning how to play. We haven't even started playing yet, so we've dedicated about a month's worth of curriculum understanding the tool of wargaming. Now, we spend the next about 110 days or so actually doing the games. And in this first case, for the class of 32, they worked on 6 different tactical problems, and they ranged, again, in adversaries from being either Japan or the Great Britain, and at times working on different aspects, battle line problems, maneuver problems, use of air, etc. And so that covers about 110 days worth of curriculum. Having completed those tactical problems, then we look at a period of about 120 days or so, where now they're looking at operational level problems. In this case, 5 different of the larger strategic and operational problems are gamed through. So now we're kind of coming towards the end of the curriculum, and there is a period of about 17 days or so, where now we're into a critique phase, and kind of looking back what worked well, what didn't work so well, and now with just a bit of the curriculum left, we do the Battle of Jutland. The Battle of Jutland is phenomenally important because it is prior to World War II, the naval battle to study. For the Age of Sail, it was the Battle of Trafalgar, and now with dreadnoughts, it is the Battle of Jutland. So the Battle of Jutland is gamed out. A full week is spent examining the Battle of Jutland. And also part of the Battle of Jutland, the students used to do their own game that took the Battle of Jutland, and rather than having it be the British versus the Germans in the North Sea, would become the United States versus the British off the coast of Nova Scotia. And it was called the Battle of Sable Island. Again, putting the students into an instructive battle with the creme de la creme, the Royal Navy. And then finally, in the last bit of the course, they had what were called the quick decision games. Whereas the previous games often had much planning time associated with them, orders writing, staff estimates as part of it, the last week are really just quick stand-up games. And they're called the quick decision games, where a battle problem is placed on the floor, a student is selected to lead, and you just immediately jump into the problem. And in that case, they did 3 of them just in this little compressed time towards the end of the curriculum. So that kind of gives you a flavor of the sorts of gaming we're doing. But again, it's all curriculum driven. These are all to drive home the lessons of the course. Now, it's not just about the students being here, though. Part of what makes this quote-unquote work for the Navy is the fact that now the students graduate, and they're going to go back to the fleet. We're going to have naval graduates now going to the major planning centers, the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations, and their War Plans Division that will receive students. The various bureaus and major shore commands will receive students. And in the bureaus, many of the bureaus are responsible for the technology. This is where the Bureau of Aeronautics will be receiving students who have just spent a year gaming and looking at how are we using aircraft? What's the future of aircraft? Well, how might they play a role in naval operations? And finally, you're going to have students that go back to major command and going back into the fleet. So you have this concentration between the fleets, the War Plans Division, and the Chief of Naval Operations Office, and all the various bureaus, and the college. And we've all got students now, graduates, who have all practiced war on the floor of the War College. And they're taking this collective understanding throughout the fleet. And this is where we start to disseminate this generalized understanding of how to fight. Not any specific war plan, but how to fight and how to think about conflict using the techniques that gaming those 300 plus days on the floor of the college would have given the students. So it's not so much about the plan. And in Edward Miller's book, War Plan Orange, he emphasizes that when we talk about the plan was more of a matter of common understanding than a set of documents. Plan Orange was one of those historical credos that is said to have been noted and filed away in the Navy's corporate memory more than it was stuck in a dusty safe someplace. Naval officers were genetically encoded, is the words he uses, to understand the challenges that war in the Pacific would present. And so whether it was consciously or unconsciously, that's the memories they dug into over the course of the war, more than just trying to actually follow some plan that was stuffed in a manila envelope. So the gaming certainly contributed, but I would offer that it was more than just trying to contribute towards what a paper plan may have said was the way to fight the Japanese. It was more about bringing up a cadre of officers who had collectively studied this problem, not necessarily together. Again, we were spanning 2 decades in here in the early 20s through the 30s. But all of them are exposed to the same problem sets. Technology changes, surely, but even with those changes in technology, it's those habits of mind that gaming instills in the officers that leads them to success. And so really, it's a matter of here, we joke with Nimitz, and he's looking over his map with Axis and Allies pieces on it. And this idea that it's not that we have done this exact problem before, but we've seen something like it before and know how to tackle it. And that's the value of the War College's contribution to the war and war gaming for the World War II.